let's start here with sourcing, because this is, for many teams, is going to be something different than your main app, or at least it's going to be tangentially related, but probably not going to be a critical feature set. So this can be one of the big hiccups, like, oh, I got to do all this work to get there. So let's look at a few really good internship options that may seem way too small or trivial for other members of the team, but are great for interns. So the first, hands down, is updating documentation. You'd be surprised at how powerful and effective that is. Documentation, as you know, as having been an engineer myself, is never up to date enough. This is a great place for it, and even more specifically, the onboarding documentation. So that first week where you're going through onboarding, this can be a very meta practice that puts a lot of purposeful action around getting things started. So specifically, you can say, hey, as you're going through getting the app set up, where you find hiccups, let's make a note of that and possibly add to the documentation. This is also an area where a lot of us as experienced engineers forget how many assumptions we just naturally make. We forget things like, oh, I already know where the terminal lives and how to interact with it and where to go. I forget that stuff. I forget that, standard test run commands, like very common you'll see in documentation, like and run the tests. I forget that sometimes you have to say how to run the tests, those being examples there. So updating documentation is an incredibly good and very useful, quite useful set of time. Another one is user accessibility audits, and there's a slight delineation between something that is like, it's kind of like SEO, where we're really making it good and you kind of need to be an expert, and yeah, sometimes we actually just need to check and make sure that we didn't conflict in colors here and things along those lines. So very oftentimes things in this zone can end up kind of low hanging because it's like, well, hey, we don't actually know if anybody is suffering from this. It's not really high enough priority. We don't have an expert for it. We know kind of the things we should think about, but not. Browser and device testing, minor version upgrades. So in the Rails world, this is a great thing to do. Probably not a Rails 6 to 7, but a Rails 6.1 to 6.2. Yeah. Yeah, and actually the inverse of that is not, and I'll talk about this here in a second, like a project to avoid is anything under like 2 or 3 major versions back. So like sub Rails 5 would not be a good project for them. Low impact, high value website upgrades. So this is another area where interns benefit a ton from understanding other areas of the business. So even if they're on your dev team, they can also be in an area of your team that's focusing on like web-based tech, but it's not the things that you're putting your engineering staff on. So this might be stuff that involves some HTML or some simple CSS or things along those lines. And then the last is some data cleanup. The caveat to data cleanup is not something that requires a batch job. Okay? So we're talking about things that are very specific. We're not having them write routines that are going to process customer data, things like that. We're talking about some kind of simple like CSV file cleanup sort of stuff. You'd be amazed at how helpful that is, even when they're not dealing in Ruby or JavaScript.